The 1980s shopping mall wasn't just a collection of stores. It was an entire world under one roof, a place where Saturday afternoons stretched into glowing evenings, and where every sight and sound felt larger than life. Walk through the doors and the hum of air conditioning greets you, mingling with the smell of pretzels and pizza drifting from the food court. Neon signs flickered above storefronts. Polished tiles reflected the shuffle of sneakers, and music poured softly from overhead speakers. But beneath all the color and excitement, there were rules. Some were printed on signs, others enforced by security guards, and many were just understood. Together, they shaped the mall experience for a whole generation. For families, the mall was a safe zone. Parents dropped off their teenagers with confidence, trusting that the walls and walkways would keep them protected. Rules gave that trust its backbone: guidelines about behavior, curfews that ensured kids weren't wandering too late, and expectations that kept the environment family-friendly. Those rules made the mall more than a place to shop. They made it a gathering spot where kids could grow up in public, with boundaries that felt both freeing and limiting at the same time. Teenagers knew these rules well. They pushed against them, of course, but they also relied on them. A mall curfew might have been annoying, but it gave structure to long Friday nights spent walking laps past record stores and arcades. A no-running sign might have stopped a game of tag, but it also kept order in a space where thousands of people crisscrossed every weekend. The rules drew invisible lines that turned the mall into a shared stage where social life played out. Everyone knew where those lines were, and most respected them, even when they complained. Not every rule was written down. There was the unspoken etiquette of not hogging a food court, table too long, the quiet understanding that you didn't blast your boombox in the middle of a corridor, the agreement that the arcade belonged to those with quarters in hand. These were codes passed from one teenager to the next, policed not just by security guards in their crisp uniforms, but by the social pressure of the crowd itself. To walk through a mall in the 1980s was to step into a community shaped by structure as much as by freedom. The rules didn't ruin the fun, they gave it shape. They made the mall feel like a place where life could happen safely, a public living room where you could test your independence under the watchful eyes of authority. It was a careful balance between trust and control, one that gave both parents and teenagers the confidence to keep coming back. But before the rules tightened, before curfews and codes defined the experience, the mall's power rested on a single idea: safety. Teenagers in the 1980s treated the mall like their own clubhouse. It was the perfect place to meet friends, walk endless laps around the same stores, and maybe spend a few dollars if they felt like it. But to the mall's management and store owners, all that hanging around without buying anything had another name: loitering. And so, one of the most famous rules of the decade was born: no loitering allowed. Signs with bold lettering were plastered near entrances and hallways, gentle reminders that the mall wasn't meant to be a living room. To teens, though, that's exactly what it was. Groups clustered outside music shops, leaned against the walls of department stores, or sat on benches for hours, laughing, gossiping, and watching the crowd. For them, it wasn't about shopping, it was about being seen. The mall was where romances started, where friendships deepened, and where the simple act of just existing together felt like an event. Store owners saw it differently. To them, teenagers leaning in doorways looked like blocked entrances, and groups gathered in front of displays often scared off paying customers. Every hour that kids hung out without pulling out their wallets was, in the eyes of business, a loss. Security guards became the middle ground between these two worlds, smiling, professional, and sometimes apologetic as they gently nudged kids to keep moving or take it inside. Many teens learned to recognize the walk of the guard headed their way, scattering before being asked to leave. The tension between social life and shopping culture was constant. Teenagers weren't causing much trouble. They were just trying to carve out a space in a world that rarely offered them one. Yet to the adults running the mall, loitering rules were necessary to keep the atmosphere comfortable for families and shoppers. The result was a strange dance. Kids finding new spots to linger, guards making their rounds, and store owners sighing with relief when the crowds dispersed. Looking back, the rule feels almost funny compared to how malls operate today. Modern malls often encourage people to linger. Cafes invite shoppers to sit with laptops for hours. Food courts are designed for long hangouts, and even Wi-Fi is free, making it easy for groups to settle in for entire afternoons without anyone batting an eye. What was once seen as wasted space and lost revenue has been rebranded as customer experience. Still, for those who grew up in the 1980s, the phrase, "no loitering," brings back memories of sidelong glances at the security guard and the thrill of staying just long enough before being told to move along. It was a rule that constantly reminded kids that they were welcome, but only if they remembered what the mall was really built for: shopping. And if you managed to stay without being kicked out, there was another rule waiting at the clock. Believe it or not, the mall had a bedtime. Just like a teenager with strict parents, the entire building followed a clock that told everyone when the fun had to end. By 9 or 10 o'clock, depending on the city, curfew began. The lights didn't go dark all at once, but the tone of the mall shifted. Security guards started walking their rounds with more purpose. Store gates began rattling down, and announcements over the loudspeaker reminded everyone that it was time to head home. For teenagers in the 1980s, these curfews were part of the rhythm of life. Friday nights were built around them. Kids would gather in the food court, make plans by the arcade, or wander through record stores knowing they had only a few hours before the sweep began. The curfew made the time feel precious. There was just enough room for laughter, flirting, and small adventures before security guards appeared, ushering groups toward the exits with polite but firm reminders. Parents quietly loved this system. It meant they could drop their teenagers off in the evening and pick them up later, confident that the mall would keep watch. The curfew was like a built-in safety feature, a kind of unofficial babysitter written into the very structure of the mall. Mothers and fathers knew their kids weren't roaming the streets late at night. They were in a brightly lit, air-conditioned world that had a natural stopping point. Of course, teenagers didn't always appreciate it. Just when the night felt like it was starting, the clock would strike 9 and the rules kicked in. You could almost feel the collective sigh of disappointment when security appeared, nudging kids toward the doors. Some tried to stretch it ducking into bathrooms, pretending to shop, or slipping into movie theaters that stayed open later. But sooner or later, the sweep would find them. The mall had its bedtime, and so did they. Today, few malls enforce strict curfews, though occasional teen bands pop up in response to rowdy crowds. The difference is telling. In the 1980s, curfews were seen as a way to keep things safe and structured, reinforcing a sense of community and trust between parents, teens, and the mall itself. Today, a curfew often signals fear of crime, fear of disruption, fear that the mall might not be able to control its own environment. The contrast reveals just how much culture has shifted in a few short decades. For those who grew up with them, mall curfews remain a strange but comforting memory. They were boundaries that kept evenings short but sweet, shaping teenage rituals in ways that still echo today. The curfew was both the end of the night and the promise of another one just a week away. But long before curfew arrived, there was one rule every kid dreaded at the entrance. For kids, malls in the 1980s felt like giant playgrounds. The endless hallways stretched out like racetracks, polished tile floors begging to be sprinted across. Escalators became moving rides, their steady hum daring kids to run the wrong way or leap off the final step with dramatic flair. To children, the mall wasn't just a place to shop. It was a wonderland of space and movement, a place where boredom was impossible if you had enough imagination. But for security guards and store managers, all that playful energy spelled one thing: chaos. That's why nearly every mall carried some version of the same posted reminder: no running, no horseplay. These weren't empty warnings. Guards kept a sharp eye out for packs of kids racing past storefronts or turning corners too fast. A sharp whistle or a stern, "Hey, knock it off," would stop a game in its tracks. Sometimes the scolding came with a lecture about safety. Other times it was just a quick gesture pointing toward the no running sign most kids had already ignored. Behind those rules was a very practical concern. The mall may have felt indestructible with its glass railings and marble floors, but one slip, one collision, or one tumble down an escalator could turn into a lawsuit. In an era when malls were packed shoulder to shoulder on weekends, accidents were easy to imagine. A spilled soda could create a slick path. A sprinting child could slam into a shopper carrying bags, or a playful shove could end with someone sprawled on the floor. Rules kept the excitement from turning into liability. Yet to the kids themselves, these rules were just part of the game. Being chased off by a guard almost added to the thrill, like being caught sneaking into a movie. The mall wasn't designed for running, but the temptation was always there. Wide open spaces, smooth surfaces, and the thrill of doing something just a little forbidden. Parents scolded, guards enforced, but the laughter of children always found a way to echo through the corridors. Looking at malls today, the approach has shifted. Instead of trying to suppress the natural energy of children, many shopping centers now create spaces where play is encouraged. Indoor playgrounds, kid zones, and entertainment areas give children an outlet without risking collisions in crowded hallways. What was once forbidden is now carefully contained, reflecting a broader change in how malls balance shopping with family experience. For those who grew up in the 1980s, though, the memory remains vivid. The chase down a long hallway, the bark of a guard's voice, and the guilty grin of being caught mid-sprint. The rule against running didn't erase the joy of movement. It simply drew the line between fun and recklessness. And in that balance, the mall became both a playground and classroom, teaching kids where freedom ended and responsibility began. And if you were lucky enough to behave, you still had to follow the food rules. Pizza slices, pretzels, sodas, and food courts in the 1980s were nothing short of paradise. They smelled like buttered popcorn and sizzling fries, a carnival of fast food gathered under one roof. Neon signs glowed above counters, trays clattered on tables, and the echo of voices made every meal feel like part of a larger festival. For teenagers, the food court was often the real destination of a mall trip. You might browse the record store or wander through clothing racks, but sooner or later, everyone ends up under the glow of those bright lights with something salty, cheesy, or sweet in hand. Yet even in paradise, there were rules. The first was simple: eat only what you bought inside. Outside snacks, whether it was a candy bar stuffed in a pocket or a bag of chips brought from home, weren't welcome. It wasn't just about keeping order. It was about protecting the ecosystem of businesses that paid rent for those spaces. Guards and mall employees weren't shy about reminding people to put away food that hadn't to come from one of the vendors. For many kids, sneaking in a soda from the convenience store outside became a kind of harmless rebellion until security spotted the label and shut it down. Another unspoken rule: don't claim a table for hours without eating. Tables were in high demand, especially on weekends, and groups of teenagers were notorious for turning them into makeshift hangouts. Malls wanted turnover. Trays on the table meant food had been purchased, but empty tables crowded with kids sipping one soda for an entire hour drew quick attention. Sometimes guards stepped in. Sometimes annoyed diners gave a pointed look until the space was cleared. Cleanliness was another expectation. Everyone was supposed to carry their trays to the trash and scrape their leftovers into the bins. Most kids did, though the occasional abandoned mess brought swift reminders from workers. It wasn't just etiquette, It kept the food court feeling orderly instead of chaotic. And then there were the absolute red lines. Food fights, rare but unforgettable when they happened, were met with immediate bans. The sight of French fries flying through the air or milkshakes dumped onto tables might have gotten laughs from friends, but mall management saw it as destruction. One outburst, and security was quick to escort culprits out, often with warnings that they wouldn't be welcome back. Compared to today, these rules feel almost quaint. Modern malls often encourage a looser, more casual atmosphere. Cafes with soft seating invite people to linger. Wi-Fi makes the food court as much a study hall as a dining space. Outside drinks are rarely questioned. What was once a tightly policed zone of quick meals has become a place where lingering is part of the appeal. Still, for anyone who grew up in the 1980s, the memory of those food court rules lingers alongside the taste of greasy pizza and warm pretzels. The rules gave order to the chaos, keeping the food court a lively but controlled centerpiece of mall life. But if food rules seemed strict, the music rules were even stricter. In the 1980s, every teenager seemed to have a boombox, or at least dreamed of carrying one. Big, boxy, and loud, they were the soundtrack of a generation, blasting mixtapes filled with the latest pop hits, breakdance beats, or heavy guitar riffs. But while teens loved to turn up the volume, malls weren't quite ready for all that noise. What sounded like fun to a group of friends lounging near the arcade often sounded like chaos to shoppers and store owners who expected something calmer. It didn't take long before malls drew the line. Signs appeared reminding everyone of the quiet shopping environment, a phrase that quickly became shorthand for turning that down. Security guards, often tasked with keeping the peace, developed a routine for handling the problem. Sometimes it was a polite request, "Please shut it off." Other times, they went straight for the batteries, confiscating them with a firm reminder that the mall wasn't the place for a concert. The conflict was bigger than just volume. Stores pumped their own music, carefully chosen to set the mood for browsing. Department stores leaned on soft background tunes, while record shops blasted the latest singles from wall speakers. Overhead announcements competed for attention, calling out sales or paging lost children. A booming beat from a teenager's shoulder-mounted stereo disrupted all of that. For mall management, it wasn't only about peace and quiet, it was about control over the atmosphere. For teenagers, though, the boombox was more than a piece of electronics. It was a badge of identity. What you played, and how loud you played it, said something about who you were. Walking through the mall with your favorite tape blasting wasn't just entertainment, it was performance. Youth culture wanted to be seen and heard, but commerce had different priorities. The clash between the two was inevitable. Looking back, the rule against loud music says a lot about the balancing act malls had to manage. They were built as social spaces, but they were still businesses. Teenagers wanted freedom of expression. Stores wanted predictable shoppers. In the end, commerce usually won. The guards silenced the stereos, and the rules made sure that the mall soundtrack was carefully curated from above, not from the crowd below. Today, the irony is clear. Malls no longer ban music, they provide. Playlists designed to match the season or the time of day drift across the halls, often at a volume far higher than the small boomboxes of the past. What once was forbidden has become a selling tool, another way to set a mood and encourage spending. Still, those who remember the 80s can picture the moment perfectly. A circle of teens huddled around a booming stereo, laughing as security approached, turning down the music just a little too late. The rule might have silenced the noise, but it couldn't erase the spirit behind it. Of course, sound wasn't the only thing controlled fashion was too. Yes, it sounds unbelievable today, but your outfit could actually get you kicked out of the mall. In the 1980s, malls weren't just shopping centers. They were cultural stages, places where image mattered almost as much as sales. Management carefully guarded the atmosphere, and clothing was a big part of that equation. Rules sometimes posted, sometimes enforced by wandering security guards, reminded everyone that there was a certain way you were expected to look if you wanted to belong inside. At the top of the list, no ripped jeans. What we now see as fashion staples were once viewed as sloppy, rebellious, even threatening. Teens who strutted in with torn denim were often told to dress properly or risk being escorted out. Bare feet? Forget it. Even on sweltering summer days, shoes were mandatory, both for safety and for appearance. And swimsuits, no matter how close the mall was to a beach or pool, were an instant violation. Malls wanted to project an image of clean, wholesome, family-friendly fun, not a rowdy beach party. This didn't stop teenagers from pushing the limits. Inspired by pop icons like Madonna, Cyndi Lauper, and Prince, kids experimented with fishnet tops, lace gloves, and oversized accessories. Every outfit became a declaration of individuality. For some, getting stopped by security for being too much was almost a badge of honor. It meant you'd succeeded in turning heads, in pushing against the mall's carefully curated sense of decency. Mall guards, meanwhile, walked a tricky line. They weren't fashion critics, but they were the front line of mall order. Stories circulated of teens being denied entry or sent home to change, all in the name of preserving a family atmosphere. While some parents appreciated the rules, others saw them as overreach, stifling their kids' creativity. And for the teens themselves, the dress code was yet another reminder that the mall, while theirs to enjoy, wasn't truly theirs to control. The contrast with today is striking. Walk through a modern shopping center, and you'll see ripped jeans sold in the very stores that once banned them. Crop tops, hoodies, swimsuits under cover-up styles that might have drawn scolding in the 80s are now encouraged as on-trend. Fashion became democratized, and malls had to adapt. Instead of keeping certain looks out, they learned to profit from them. In hindsight, these dress code rules captured the tug-of-war between freedom and decency, individuality and conformity. The 1980s mall wanted to be both a place for youth and a place safe for families, and policing fashion seemed like a solution. But for the teens who lived through it, the memory of being judged for an outfit lingers as a symbol of how much times and styles have changed. And once you were dressed right, you had to follow one more unwritten rule. If the food court was for families, the arcade was for warriors, and it came with its own rules. Step into an 80s mall arcade, and you'd be greeted by a wall of noise, the chime of coins dropping, the digital explosions of Space Invaders, the pulsing soundtrack of Pac-Man gobbling dots. The room was dimly lit, glowing with neon and the hypnotic flash of game screens. To kids and teens, it wasn't just entertainment. It was an arena, and everyone inside knew the code. First, the money. Only quarters worked here. No outside tokens from local pizza parlors. No fake slugs if you wanted to play. You came prepared with pockets jingling. Change machines were posted like sacred shrines at the edges of the arcade, spitting out rolls of quarters that vanished fast. A whole allowance could disappear in one Saturday afternoon. Then came the rule of the line. Popular machines Pac-Man, Street Fighter, Galaga drew crowds. You waited your turn, and when your game ended, you stepped aside. Winners stayed on the machine, losers moved out of the way. No exceptions. Cutting in line was practically a crime, a surefire way to start a shouting match, or worse. To mark your place, players would slap a quarter down on the glass screen as a silent claim. I'm next. Everyone respected that symbol. It was an unspoken law. Of course, with so many teenagers packed into a dark, noisy room, trouble sometimes flared. A shove, a bad loss, or an insult could spiral quickly. That's when mall security stepped in. Guards would wander through, checking IDs, reminding everyone that the mall wasn't just an arcade. It was still a public space. One too many warnings, and you were escorted outside, your Saturday gaming session cut short. Yet for most kids, the arcade wasn't about trouble. It was about belonging. It was a place where skill earned respect, where the best player in the room became a kind of celebrity. Crowds gathered behind whoever held the high score, watching intently as lives ticked down and the screen filled with flashing enemies. The glow of those machines created a culture all its own, one that thrived on competition, but also carried a strange sense of fairness. Today, online gaming has replaced those unspoken rules. Players compete from their bedrooms instead of huddling shoulder to shoulder in a dark arcade. There are still lines, but they're virtual. There are still winners and losers, but the cheers or insults come through headsets instead of from the crowd behind you. Something has been gained in accessibility, but something has been lost in that electric sense of gathering, of standing in the same space with others who share the same passion. And once you left the arcade, there was one final rule that summed up mall life in the 80s. The 1980s mall wasn't just a shopping center. It was a world with rules that asked for one thing of respect. Respect the space, respect the people inside it. Respect the unspoken order that allowed thousands of families, friends, and teenagers to coexist under one roof. From the tiled floors that echoed with footsteps to the skylights that poured sunshine onto indoor fountains, malls carried a certain weight. They weren't just places to buy jeans or pizza slices. They were the cultural temples of suburban America. The rules, both posted and unspoken, were part of what held that temple together. No loitering, no running, no blaring music, no breaking curfew. These boundaries created a sense of safety and trust. Parents dropped their kids off, knowing someone was watching, that the mall itself would enforce limits. Teens understood that freedom came with conditions, that to stay in this world, you had to play by its laws. Looking back, those rules might feel restrictive. They could frustrate, embarrass, or even spark rebellion. Yet they also built a shared understanding. Everyone who grew up in that era remembers the same signs, the same scoldings from guards, the same subtle negotiations between freedom and order. It was part of the fabric of small life, shaping not just how people behaved, but how they remembered those years. Nostalgia clings to that balance. The mall gave kids independence, but within guardrails. You could meet your friends, wander the shops, eat, laugh, and linger, so long as you didn't break the code. It was a kind of freedom that felt safe, a world just big enough to test limits without straying too far. The rules didn't destroy the fun, they defined it. Without them, the mall might have been chaos. With them, it became a place where an entire generation learned how to gather. Today's malls are looser, more casual. Dress codes have disappeared. Music comes from overhead speakers instead of boomboxes. Food courts welcome laptops and lingering. Security still exists, but the sense of strict order has faded. The shift reflects larger cultural changes. The move from public gathering to private convenience, from shared codes of conduct to individual freedoms. In some ways, the mall's rules feel like relics from a slower, more trusting time. And yet, their memory still matters. The rules of the 1980s mall were more than guidelines for behavior. They were lessons in community. They taught kids to share space, to respect boundaries, to see themselves as part of something larger. Even now, when many malls stand half-empty or transformed, those echoes remain. They live in the smell of pretzels, the sound of coins clinking in an arcade, the memory of a security guard's whistle carried down long, bright hallways. Respect the mall that was the final rule. And maybe, in remembering it, we remember how much those places taught us about being together. So what about you? What's your favorite mall memory from the 1980s, or the first rule you ever broke?